Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gunn. I am the historian of medicine, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. Since 2018, the Institute for Advanced Study, or IAS, has partnered with USpatial, the University of Minnesota libraries on the Twin Cities, Duluth, and Morris campuses, Dash and Lattice, to present the annual Thinking Spatially symposium. At this event, we hope to offer participants an interdisciplinary approach to exploring the spatial context of a range of historic and current events, as well as the opportunity to identify and recognize the value of data visualization and the role of maps in presenting data. We're very grateful to have you with us this year for our second entirely online event. And today we look forward to exploring the topics of mapping civic and community engagement with several wonderful presenters. And I just want to recognize, this is on your screen right now, the work of the wonderful team of people who have spent a lot of time putting this together and who bring such skills and creativity to the process. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that wherever you may be joining us from today, we are all located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The Twin Cities campus of the University of Minnesota resides on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. We acknowledge that this place has a complex and layered history. A land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS and our partners are committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. I'd also like, so you guys are, I'm sure, used to the Zoom universe now, and I apologize, but we have a long list of technical instructions. We do have live transcription available today. To enable that option, click on the live transcript box at the bottom of your Zoom menu bar, or if you're on a mobile device, it might be in the top right menu, and then select Show Subtitles. We'll have time for question and answers after each presenter, as well as time for additional questions at the end of the event. If you have questions for our speakers at any time during today's presentations, you can enter them through the Zoom Q&A feature, which is also located in the Zoom menu bar. Chat is enabled if you want to introduce yourselves, share resources, have conversations. Throughout the event, use the chat feature, which is also found in the Zoom menu bar. And please be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you send your message. But you can't cut and paste from chat to the Q&A, so please enter your questions in the Q&A box. You'll notice that we are recording today. This recording will be available on the symposium website within about a week following the event. And finally, when you leave us today, you will be prompted to take a very brief 3-question survey about today's event. Please do this. Your feedback will help ensure that we continue developing and crafting the best possible event experience for many years going forward. And we do appreciate the time this takes. And now, without further delay, let's get into today's program. In addition to the schedule you see on the slideshow now, our moderator has also shared a link to the full schedule in chat, so you can open that up for yourselves. Each presenter will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A before moving on to the next speaker. Following these presentations, Stacy Stark will take us on a deep dive of USpatial's research initiatives and support services. She will also tell us a bit more about the public engagement map, known as the public engagement footprint, that the Office for Public Engagement has been working on, and which may interest many of our University of Minnesota attendees. We'll conclude with time for additional Q&A and reflection on the day. I'll save thorough introductions of each presenter for directly before their time. So for now, please simply help me offer the warmest of welcomes to Tim Griffin, Amalia Jubara, Rebecca Walker, Fernando Berga, and Stacy Stark, and our presenting partners. Welcome all, and thanks so much for joining us. So starting us off today is Tim Griffin, who will be presenting participatory geodesign for regenerative community futures. Tim is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the co-lead of the Minnesota Design Center's Design for Community Regeneration project, which is informally known in the acronym world as D4CR. He is a senior research fellow at the Minnesota Design Center and a PhD candidate in architecture. His work focuses on using geodesign as an innovation and system resource to use with communities to collaborate on shared values and equitable economic development. Over the past 4 years, he's been developing this approach with the International Geodesign Collaborative through work in the Creative Enterprise Zone, Minneapolis Root District, Farmers Market, and a D4CR pilot project in Warren, Minnesota. Welcome, Tim.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. If I can just confirm that you can see the screen, I can't see chat, so that's part of the situation here. I'm going to present. Design D4CR, work in D4CR statewide, and also a pilot project that we've done in Warren, Minnesota. Okay, so I'm going to just start with this this one here. There we go. Okay, so D4CR Warren, or I'm sorry, I apologize here. Third time will be the charm, I hope. There we go. Three strikes and you're out. So we're ready to go here. So D4 Design for Community Regeneration is an initiative from the Minnesota Design Center, where we are looking to use, and I'll define these terms throughout the conversation, but looking to use geodesign, the combination of design and geography through GIS and community negotiation, and also our work with the International Geodesign Collaboration at through the Minnesota Design Center. And so with a grant back in 2019, we developed this notion of a community regenerative design process that could be used throughout the state. And then we also proposed to pilot the project eventually through the partnership with the Northwest Regional Sustainable Development Partnership to pilot it in Northwest Minnesota. And so what I'm going to present today is a little bit about the overall D4CR process, but also our experience halfway through essentially the pilot project in Warren. Okay. Okay, we've been involved with Esri and the Geodesign Summit over the last few years, and have been presenting progress along the way in terms of innovation development, mapping, and as you know, this time frame corresponds with the dawn of COVID, so trying to doing this completely remotely. Okay. I'm going to ask here that that the moderator posts the link for this website in chat, or you can use the QR code. And I'd like to do kind of a fun and maybe a bit self-serving activity, in that we'd like you to, over the course of the day, sign into this website take a small survey, locate where you're coming from, and we can continue this conversation not offline but online as we go forward. So you just take a moment to either copy the QR code, look in chat, which I can't see, and do that. I'm going to switch sites at this point. So this is the story map for the Warren project that I'm going to use, and this is the one that came up 3 times in a row as we got started. So I'm going to go through this, and you can talk a little bit about this. The first of all is the group of folks that were involved in this project, and we had a kind of a partnership of teams from the university and also from the local community as part of the project, and specifically with USpatial, Len Kinney and Audra, research assistant Audrey Heike, and they have their story to tell, and we can do that in more detail, or they can tell it in more detail another time. But it was a lot of fun. Okay. As I mentioned, the program is through the Minnesota Design Center, and our co-leads are myself, Joni Kuhlman Brigham, and Dewey Thorbeck. And I think Joni spoke at the session last year. And the pilot project, one of the aspects of this D4CR is that not only over fullness of time, in terms of rolling this out across the state, which is an important part of the land grant mission of the university. We've had this notion of clusters, that there be clusters of more urban communities, more rural, and communities on the interstitial between that. And so our cluster is actually, and has been engaged, is the cities of Crookston, Warren, and Halleck, and over time, both Crookston and Halleck will go through the same version of this effort that Warren has gone through. So Warren is the first of the cities. Okay. Our growing network of partners includes those cities that I mentioned: Crookston, Warren, and Halleck, the Northwest Regional Development Commission, Minnesota Extension, where the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership is located, USpatial, CERTS, and the Minnesota Design Center. We had made an initiative to have a local community engagement, trusted advocate approach, and we're pleased, or we're lucky to have Carrie Miska, who's a local high school teacher or K through 12 teacher, serve that role. And this group of folks had outreach to really 4 point of view groups, which I'll talk a little bit more in the future. But part of this process is the idea that there are distinct points of view in a community, and this is a portion of how the process is organized. The process is very much dependent on the IGC, International Geodesign Collaborative kind of matrix of GIS place mapping, with that looks at the layers of data that USpatial has assembled, and it includes water infrastructure, green infrastructure, agriculture, energy, transportation, industry, housing, and as the core layers, and then 2 layers that we established around economic development and design for equity. Okay. We draw from the IGC's bank of innovations in all of these areas, and we create menus of selected innovations, selected innovations that could be applied locally in the city of Warren. And this is done collaboratively with the four recruit point of view teams. So it's a co-design process where they're involved in understanding the principles and then also applying them where they could apply locally. And in a sense, that's a notion of almost a backcasting project, if you will, in terms of how all of those how those could play out. And in the Q&A, I can talk a little bit about how those were measured in terms of their regenerative design impact. The important session, I think, or the important component of this is the negotiation and decision process that you see on the right in the decide area. Those 4 point of view teams in a workshop essentially order from a menu of things that they feel would be high priorities for the community, and the colors carefully of how they relate in terms of color. But red is used for existing residents and businesses. Blue is used for organizations and institutions in the community. Green, the government units, which traditionally have conducted these processes, and the yellow is for investors, both public and private. And it's an interesting process. We've gone through it about 5 or 6 times at the Design Center in different sessions, both in design studios, but also in community engagement exercises. And the most recent one of which was the Root District that was mentioned in my bio. But the negotiations go through 2 rounds. Groups 1 and 2 put up all of their items and then decide which ones they agree on and which ones they add. And then finally, repeat that around again. The implementation period that we're just starting looks at prototypes in terms of identifying 4 to 6 of those, and we've just been funded to do that. And in terms of where we will go with the next year with Warren. So that's the kind of the overall piece. I mentioned the point of view team tasks in terms of organizing that. The GIS map that has been created for that have all of the layers is interactive for the community members. We've also done a community survey in terms of leading up where people have gone out and identified place mapping and ideas and sensibilities around their community. And we continue to run that. And then, as I said, these workshops that we did were done entirely online. We used a Moreau dashboard, and honestly, we're able to make the technology fairly simple so that people were able to get in and discuss it. One of the notions that came out were the idea of bundles of projects that could be applied throughout the area and located on the maps. And you can see some of the themes, including community market and gardens, affordable manufactured housing, eco-ag tourism, river parks, safe routes, school hub, a resilient school hub, and downtown CBD and golf village. The resilient school hub was one that was mentioned in all 4 teams, and a lot of our prototypes are going to be focused on the school hub in the area. We talked about this going through. Vision workshop, the 4 teams, as I said, put together their entire package. And I'll just conclude here as I think we're winding up of the kind of the outcomes that each of the groups had. And these were marked graphically. And one of the accomplishments at the end was that we were able to actually make this real time on a dashboard that I'm going to switch to as we end. But again, the government units, you can see what their prioritized bundles were and other projects. Investors the same way. The negotiation rounds I described earlier. and then where we are today. Just in September, we've gotten funding to do the prototyping approach, and invite you to join D4CR Net and to show that. And do I have a moment left, or are we at about time with this?
Yes, you have a moment.
Okay, I'm going to attempt one more slide change here. Oops. Just do one more here. Just do one more here, and we will wind up. If you can see that, and please just cut me off as we wind up with time, and I can leave this on the screen as we go forward. But this, at the end result, we were able to kind of graphically reproduce in GIS those drawings that you saw in the presentation, and we're also able on the left to put in a regenerative design scorecard that as you looked at innovations and filters, these are the layers that we showed you before, you can actually start putting on various improvements. And if you look on the left hand side, you can see how they're impacting the water. For example, these are the water innovations, right? And so you can see where this is. So I think I'll leave it with that. I know there's I went through a lot of material, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. But that's D4CR in progress and in pilot. We're going to be doing convening our network convening later this year, and continue the conversation, and really appreciate our partnership with Northwest RSDP, the Extension Service. They work, well, Northwest doesn't, but RSDP works statewide, and we're just excited about the opportunities for this and promise to make it simpler the next time that we show it to people. Our ultimate goal is to look at gaming design in terms of making this accessible, but very, very impressed with the adaptability and the speed in which the community picked up on this and were able to help pilot this project with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. This is really exciting and fascinating to look at. We have time for one or two questions, and we have one to start us off. What is one area in which you wish to improve this approach?
There's a technical and a interpersonal layer. I think the idea of community engagement, honestly, we were at 20 or 25 people per workshop. Our local advocate did a wonderful job reaching out, but the time frame of the pilot stretched it out, and so we're not representing this as totally representative. The goal is, though, to have these points of view. Secondly, from the technological side, we were thrilled to actually get to a working dashboard by the end. We didn't know if we were going to get there or not for the final workshop, and it was a joy to see that work in context. And so again, it is a pilot project. So those are the two areas: community engagement and making the technology more accessible. And we think we can move in that direction.
Great, thank you. That actually was sort of my question about how community members were recruited and what their concerns were about the technology or the process.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, there were 4 workshops during the course, and again, they were all remote. Warren has a data hub at their drive-in theater on the west side of the community, where they frequently gather for large community events. COVID was a very strange experience to actually work as architects and designers and geographers and planners working in a place without being there is just remains very bizarre. And we'll work, but we were able to do that. And in fact, the prototyping project, those 4 to 6 ideas, the goal is to present those at the county fair next spring. So hopefully we're back in place with that.
That's great. We have 2 minutes left, and I am going to read, and we have 2 more questions. So I'll just read the first one, and then I think we'll ask you to type an answer to the second one. The geodesign process strikes me as having a lot of similarities with the transition movement's concept of energy descent planning. Are you familiar with that? And if so, do you have or foresee connections with the transition movement?
I'm not familiar with that particular term. We've been working with the Center for Sustainable Building Research, and embedded in this conversation has been the 21st century development standards that were developed between University of Minnesota and AIA Minnesota. I'll certainly follow up on that partnership. And the notion that we're going towards is regenerative design, and what the obstacles are to that beyond sustainability. So that's our that's kind of our platform.
And I have just been informed that I am reading the schedule wrong. And in fact, we have more time for questions. And so I really apologize for almost cutting you off. So the next question says, I work with communities who are a little frustrated that engagement processes around development projects often don't have accountability mechanisms. That is, there aren't mechanisms to hold cities, counties, developers to the findings from the engagement processes. I've been trying to think through this, and I'm wondering what sorts of accountability mechanisms or processes have been built into design for CR.
That's a really good question. One of my colleagues was at a session with Green Step Cities just this week, where they looked at community engagement in general. And you're absolutely right in terms of, I think the main theme, emerging theme, was a theme of trust. And how does that, how do you trust, in fact, that if you spend time in these processes, that what you come up with will actually be reflected and carried through. A few thoughts on that. One is that in this process anyway, we're attempting to develop a network of affiliate communities that want to learn about the process and learn from the various pilot projects so they can assess it for themselves. The second is the negotiation process. We have all been involved in community planning engagements, whether they're associated with comprehensive plans or development plans review or whatever, that list hundreds of ideas and priorities. And I think in respect for the people who voice those opinions, we tend to put too many priorities into these documents. And really what D4CR acknowledges that, and in fact, that's what the menu represents. The menu represents a list of potential innovations that might work in their community, right? And so going through the negotiation process, we typically wind up with 6 to 12 initiatives that are supported by all 4 points of view group. Now, what is the legal standing of those point of view groups? These could be done in conjunction with comprehensive plans, which have formal task forces. And I think from the the current terminology around accountability are these notions of community benefit agreements that emerge out of the process. Now, adopting a plan or a development plan should also put it into have a legal standing in terms of a commitment to implementing it. So I think the idea of creating a sense of trust among the participants can't happen during a project or a project review. There has to be a ground groundwork for that set earlier, and we're trying to do that with the D4CR network, as well as how we actually do the projects themselves.
Thanks, Tim. I want to remind people that the video of this event will be available in about a week on the symposium webpage, and also draw your attention to a post in the chat from Tracy Kugler about the Transition Movement and Regenerative Communities virtual summit, which is coming up in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Tracy. We'll see you. We'll join you there for that.
Okay, and are there, yes, there are 2 more questions. How did you determine the representation of community members? And how did you decide who is important to be a part of these conversations and workshops?
Yes, thanks for that. Thanks for that. The first conceptually was and you can break it into more groups than this, but we felt that the 4 point of view groups that we identified represented the kind of the range of stakeholders in a project. We also felt that the existing residents and businesses point of view frequently is the least well articulated or listened to. And so what our goal was to have 4 simultaneous conversations, and I'll get to the makeup of the group in a moment, but to have 4 simultaneous conversations that use the same information and resources around innovations, had talked about what their respective values and priorities were, and then illustrated the outcomes in a similar fashion, so that we had maps, we had data, and we had advocates going forward. The look at from an equity and engagement point of view, we look at the lens of all those groups, with again a particular attention on residents and businesses. And so we relied on, we kind of stated that goal going through and relied on our local advocates to come up with as diverse and representative a group, again, particularly for the residents and businesses. And in Northwest Minnesota, it's fairly homogeneous and fairly white. We are in near native land. We're in native lands and near reservations, though this was focused more on the downtown area. We expect that some of these these 3-city cluster developments in the future will have an opportunity to really look at the demographics of what is how those areas are made up. So those were the expectations in the pilot going through, and we'll assess how well we did that.
Thank you. And here's a question I'm always curious about. How do you measure health and happiness?
Well, we look at a lot of the work in community well-being. I invite you, let's see if the moderator could put 21cd.org, I believe it is. I have to find the correct notation. I'll put it in the chat. 21stcenturydevelopment.org has been our kind of our foundational base, and it had 7 pilot areas, including health and happiness, and including equity. And so those 2 are very strongly linked, but they have ideas that are that represent various barriers against that. But I think the definition of happiness and well-being, that I think we've counted over 30 different organizations that interpret that and talk about it. We're trying to have that parallel the other conversations, and so we asked that question in terms of what is the relative frame of mind of the community with obviously stresses of the pandemic, but also historical stresses of racial racial justice and relationships and so on and so forth. So we're trying to put a subjective, a very not really subjective, but it's less to try to measure that scientifically. I think it's a state of mind that is the community kind of puts it on a spectrum of what their relative happiness is.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. This has been a fascinating presentation, and I really appreciate the questions too. And we're going to move on to our next presenter now, who is Amalia Jubara, and she will be presenting on Mapping Community Aid Networks, Lessons on Solidarity and Access. Amalia Jubara is an active community member and urban researcher who strives to undertake interdisciplinary and intersectional analysis of social justice issues. Amalia helped to found the Twin Cities Mutual Aid Project, TC Map, a collective formed after George Floyd's murder to map ongoing mutual aid efforts. TC Map is composed of community members who came together from many different lived experiences. Some are students, some are professionals. They believe in direct action, many love to cook, and most of them are self-proclaimed nerds. Our community was and still is in crisis, and TC Map aims to make that crisis easier to navigate. So welcome, Amalia, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your map.
Hi, my name is Amalia Jubara, and I'm one of those self-proclaimed nerds, and I represent the Twin Cities Mutual Aid Project, known as TC Map, and you can find us at tcmap.org. In the days following George Floyd's murder on Monday, May 25th, 2020, demands for justice led by our Minneapolis community sparked worldwide protests against police brutality and systemic racism. Amid the uprisings, grocery stores and other critical infrastructure were impacted. Social media platforms were overwhelmed with information and urgent needs from the community, but these calls were often lost in a flood of other posts. To address confusion about which stores were open and which were closed, volunteer community members thought of making a public spreadsheet so people could get clear and accurate information. On the evening of Friday, May 29th, one of our community members posted to Facebook asking for people to help populate the spreadsheet. They continued recruiting through the night, and a scrappy team began to form. By the next morning, we had about 40 people on board making calls and entering data, and the store status map was born. We updated this map based on community-driven data, and it worked. This first map provided crucial information about which stores were open and when. The following day, we were asked to do the same thing, but this time for resource distribution and mutual aid sites that were cropping up across the metro. While some sites were being overwhelmed with goods, others were in desperate need. And listening to feedback from community members, we decided a mutual aid map could help streamline efforts across the city. That's when we recruited developers. Within 2 days of the initial call to action, TC Map was a thriving project built on well-known tools: Google Sheets, Google My Maps, email, Facebook pages, and more. But the initial tools didn't refresh the map automatically and led to stale data on the site. The first developers to join the group worked through the night of May 30th to stand up a custom web application that used the Google Sheets API to display the data on the map. In the first 3 weeks of the map's life, the project grew at an unbelievable pace. By the end of the aid map's first week, we actually had a volunteer force of more than 100 people organizing in the TC Map Slack channel, plus a group of open source developers who had found the project through GitHub or other local civic hacking groups. We developed a multi-team structure, including direct outreach volunteers who worked with sites, learned their needs, and communicated back, and data entry volunteers who managed the Google Sheets with all the site's details. The map was being shared all over, and media roundups of ways to help routinely linked to TC Map. At first, data entry volunteers were overwhelmed by constant traffic. The minute we addressed one Facebook DM from a resource site or on-the-ground volunteer, we received 6 more. In the beginning, we had almost 1.1 thousand hits per hour. We had overlapping shifts of multiple volunteer teams working literally around the clock for weeks, and we still could not keep up with the information load. Over time, though, the general public's sense of urgency faded and attention to the site waned. The media moved on and aid sites saw a dramatic decrease in donation traffic. Out of sight, out of mind is often human nature. We see spikes in site traffic and demand for information, both to give and receive, immediately following violent and tragic events that capture public attention. But there's a direct correlation between the magnitude of these spikes and the amount of media coverage surrounding the event. For instance, there was a 372% increase in site views in the week following the police murder of Dante Wright compared to the previous week. Yet other violent events, such as the police murder of Dolal Eid, which received less publicity, saw far smaller site traffic increases. Regardless of cyclical decreases in visibility and awareness, however, our community's needs persist relentlessly in the shadow of ongoing resource insecurity, COVID-19 pandemic, the aftermath of the uprising, and continued state violence at the hands of law enforcement. Because of this, we continue to be a hub that catalogs ongoing resource needs and availability throughout the Twin Cities. As the number of sites grew, we had to evaluate the technology used to support the map. We moved away from the Google Sheets and currently use Airtable database to store site details. Volunteers update site information in Airtable, and those updates get reflected on the website using Mapbox, a customizable mapping and location platform to display sites located throughout the Twin Cities communities. As of this week, there are more than 380 resource sites represented on the map. And actually at one point we had close to 550. Since TCMap was created to be in service to the community, we have an obligation to listen and make improvement to our data and the map based on community advice and feedback, not just around the quality of our information or the immediacy of our updates, but also how the map functions as a resource. Many of our added features have come directly from community requests, such as noting which sites do not require identification or marking nearest public transit options. These requests often occur through communication via social media and through conversations we have with people in our day-to-day lives. Shaping the map based on public need, we are able to provide more information about sites, and listing detailed information on the map empowers map users to truly have a choice in their destination. Their participation in resource acceptance or distribution can be voluntary because they're given the tools to make an informed decision about where they want to go and what they'll experience when they're there. As the map has evolved, so has the picture of need in our communities. This allowed us to create focused visibility and awareness campaigns through community outreach in 2020, including paying translators to the map, and outreach flyers could be offered in over 10 distinct languages. Other than very specific asks like for translators, we decided not to accept funds as an organization. In the beginning, these were actually offered fairly frequently. As a collective that was growing at a dizzying pace, we talked extensively about whether pursuing 501c3 status or a relationship with a fiscal agent was in line with our principles and mission, but we did not want to be financially dependent on institutions invested in the charity model of resource distribution. Mutual aid principles value solidarity, not charity, and charity practices often involve resourced, privileged, or state-originated programs and people making decisions about the provisions of support to under-resourced people. Determinations are made about who gets services, what the eligibility requirements are, and what people need to do to maintain services. Tracking the requirements imposed by traditional nonprofits and social service organizations showed us the ways in which government and charity frameworks legitimize certain kinds of need and certain dimensions of identity while invalidating others. Mutual aid rejects the notion that anyone can make determinations about the survival and humanity of others, which is a crucial perspective in a system built upon white supremacy and social hierarchy, where people's race, gender, and socioeconomic status are huge determinants of people's survivability. As we developed as a collective, we clarified and defined our values as community members navigating social and political crisis. Our collective believes that mutual aid means creating networks of freely given assistance and shared resources in order to make us all stronger and safer. For us, and many in the Twin Cities, supporting mutual aid means building connections with and between existing resource sites and mutual aid networks to create pathways for resource redistribution. We approach our work as a form of reciprocal care. TCMap supports independent communities that collaboratively work towards an equitable future. We actively solicit the input and involvement of people with a range of perspectives and wisdom from many backgrounds. We succeed when we work in community with one another. We listen to communities' expressed needs, and we welcome criticism, concerns, and new ideas. Recognizing we will make mistakes, we're committed to continuous evolution. We're not a frontline project, and we exist behind the scenes to offer support, not take the spotlight. However, these lessons are not new. One of the most famous examples of community care practices in the US is the Black Panther Party survival programs of the 60s and 70s. These programs included a free breakfast program, free clinics, rides for elderly people doing errands, and more. We see similar actions occurring across historical and present-day Indigenous practices, labor movements, fights for liberation. After a year of rapid development and collective burnout, TC Map shifted to a small group of 12 volunteers updating the map on a nightly basis. We formed out of crisis, and from that crisis, we learned many lessons about mapping resource networks, prioritizing public need over private interest, and the sustainability of mutual aid in practice. When you map grassroots resource networks like supply depots, encampment support services, transportation aid, alongside other state city infrastructure like Metro Transit, social service organizations, housing services, you can better visualize where social services provided by the local government are meeting population needs, where they are failing to meet needs, and where community-driven aid networks are filling the gaps. Documenting landscapes and neighborhoods that are built along lines of mutuality, community, and care, rather than lines of district, county, neighborhood, and zip code, empowers community development and redefines urban spaces that have been historically shaped by racist urban policy like redlining, racial covenants, and restrictive zoning. We've learned this throughout history, and we are directly learning now that mutual aid altogether is really in conflict with the state capital apparatus, because mutual aid projects and ensuring community members have a voice in their own survival are often bluntly against the interests of those who do not need its services, whom are oftentimes those who make policy decisions. When there are mutual aid sites that are producing goods like vegetables through garden space, when these sites interrupt the local capital flow, it is in conflict with the state capital apparatus. This conflict at times puts you in opposition to the police, because the police are kind of enforcers of property value. You are not only in conflict with the agents of direct state violence, but you are in conflict with the more passive economic violence of the circumstances that led to the need for mutual aid in the first place. So how does this relate to interactive mapping? Mutual aid in practice is often under-resourced individuals supporting each other, which is a part of what makes it difficult to sustain. However, when those involved in mutual aid are in community together, there is a sort of epistemic advantage. They are receivers of the services they distribute. They see the harms, and they directly witness where services are needed. This is a kind of data collection that data analysts, academic researchers, legislators, and geographers don't always make use of. It is a missing and undervalued, almost ethnographic approach. Creating these open source and participatory maps shaped by public need rather than private interest pushes back against the power relations that can be embedded in historical map making processes and actively decolonizes how we view urban space. There has been much literature written about the colonial histories of mapping and the way in which maps have been used to enforce boundaries, xenophobia, environmental racism, and imperial ideas of property. Mapping visibilizes, and when it's just one creator, mapping can visualize that singular vision. In creating a map that grew from community voices, offerings, and needs, we can see much more about how we and our neighbors experience the cities. So what can we learn from stories like TC Map? Because TC Map is not a success story. It is a story of state violence, of community trauma and crisis, of navigating the costs of labor. And it is a story about building a collective and a community that isn't beholden to charity metrics and ideas of measurable impact. There's no happy story here about how good and sustainable support structures can be, because there can be no such story when the institutions responsible for providing such structures are indifferent or hostile to the people who need them and the people who implement them, which is where we were and where we largely still are. And this is inherently labor-intensive work. The resources required to make it successful in the long run are extremely difficult for the people who show up to provide, especially as the machine grinds on violently back to normal, as people resume other work and the expectations of one's day-to-day labor capacity increases. There are many things that we at TCMAP have failed at. Feedback about the map often mostly came from people with more access, whether to systems, time, resources. We didn't always have the resources or focus as a collective to get more in-depth feedback to drive the site's offerings more directly from the needs and wants of people seeking aid versus others. People wanting to give aid were the most vocal users initially. Collecting and entering data that are inherently ad hoc, interpersonal, and rapidly evolving is demanding and time intensive. There are fundamental challenges of a tool designed to support people with less access that is also reliant on internet access. So how can we radically rethink support for community-based and led organizations that don't fit into and or radically challenge existing resource distribution models and mapping practices? It's impossible to imagine a crisis in which mutual aid efforts are not needed. So if we really care about having policies and institutional practices that are supportive of work like TCMAP, it's worth asking how resources can be directed to the organizations doing the work without requiring them to transform into something that fits the structures that produced the need for them in the first place. If we think of TCMAP as a case study rather than a success story, we can see that it makes a case for a paradigm change. Because social justice efforts are always happening everywhere. We did not make a single aid site come into existence. All we did was make the effort to find, amplify, and make more accessible the information about resources that already existed in the community and attempt to direct more resources to them. There is always more work to be done in terms of discovering, resourcing, and visibilizing existing networks of aid. Because mutual aid is not a short-term solution, as the barriers that systemically ignore and deprive communities are not short-term. As community members, we need to push harder against the failed structures that currently exist. We need perpetual advocacy for, the value of, the need for, and the long-term availability of not only mutual aid, but the direct action of including our neighbors in the sourcing of knowledge. By doing so, we can actively shift the concentration of power where power is concentrated, from boards of directors and philanthropic organizations to neighbors and elders and youth. Ensuring that those receiving services are included in research and decision-making roles can create a system that includes rather than excludes our most structurally marginalized neighbors. So I end this presentation to ask, what would it look like if instead of imposing those same failed structures, researchers, geographers, urban planners, you in the audience, went in with the idea that your job was to amplify existing place-based solutions and community voices? What would that look like? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amalia. Those are great and provocative questions for us to start with. And before we start the Q&A, let me just remind you, you can enter your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom Zoom bar. And also, Amalia, for the questions, will be joined by two other TCMAP collective members, Julie Yu and Emily Ewan. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us, Julie and Emily. And we will.
Oh, technical difficulties. Thanks, happy to be here.
Emily and Julie, do you want to introduce, while people are entering questions, do you want to introduce yourselves a little more than just your names?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So my name is Emily Ewan. I've been with TCMAP since almost the very beginning. So I have sort of a broad knowledge of the transitions that Amalia spoke to a bit. Lately, I've been working more on the tech side of things. So I'm hoping to be able to provide some support if there are any technical questions related to the app. I'll do my best to provide knowledge in that area.
Great, thanks. And Julie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie, and I, similarly to Emily, have been with the map since almost the very beginning, since June of about a year and a half ago. And I primarily with the map work in conjunction with community aid sites to update data, information about their needs, and am connected with many of those sites as well. So can provide a little bit of perspective about what those relationships look like and what long-term relationship building has looked like. Oh, I apologize for that. Let me see. Is it helpful?
It just means lean in. So you're closer to the mic. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and say this is just an amazing effort, both in a technological and a human sense. And one of my questions is, you know, when it's 100 people, how are you coordinating, let alone attending to the emotional needs of the work of 100 people?
Yeah, do you mind, Julie and Emily, do you mind if I answer this? Okay, so I love this part because we are very silly people, a lot of us, and we created this multi-team structure that was based on animal kingdoms. Where we had people going and working on their strengths. The people who did more communications were called the dolphin team, and the people who went out to community sites to directly speak to people were called the penguins, because penguins march. And we created this system that actually was very functional for a while, where we had people, this Slack channel where people could directly communicate, and had an organizational system within that where there were different channels and different where, like, if I was needed help with like a communication side of things, I can post in the dolphin channel. We had people who a beaver team, which, because beavers are builders, who helped with more of the like foundational vision of things. And it was a very unique and fun way to organize the system, and it worked for quite a long time. As we slowly like became a smaller group, we transitioned to sort of all, it became a bit more collective in a sense without these team-like structures, and more just working together, since it's now just mostly a group of 12 people.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, now the questions are filling up here. How are resources from the Mutual Aid Project made available to those who do not have access to internet? You had mentioned on-the-ground volunteers, but are there any others? Has this changed as the weather changed in the cities?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this, and very much please jump in, Amalia and Emily, and let me know if I keep coming through quiet. But I would say that Amalia mentioned this in her presentation, but we understand that access to the map is pretty restricted because it's based on having internet. Very early on, we did print versions of the map for distribution at some sites, and found that that was, you know, resource high and utility low, and so have stopped kind of doing that. But something that we also really emphasize is that we're really just an intermediary, and the resources are where the sites are. And what we're really trying to do is help make sure that abundance finds its way to need. And so part of that is advocacy that we do in our own lives, in terms of just letting people know where some of these sites are. Some of this is just connecting sites, like letting sites know where, if they have extra resources, where they can bring those if there's another site that has more need. We really, really rely on community connections to kind of expand the profile of other sites. So the map, I would say, just from my experience as a lizard and in the community, primarily gets resources to people who don't have internet access by making sure that we are in contact with sites, and that we know what sites need, and that we're making sure that they get those things, or that they have access to other people who have access to those resources and can redistribute there. So that is kind of where the on the ground work happens, as Amalia mentioned, where we're not frontline.
Okay, great. And if anybody wants to tack on an answer, just unmute yourself and add on. Okay, the next question is, Amalia, thanks so much for your great presentation and work. Sometimes when we make our sites visible, they also become more vulnerable to being cited, taken down, or destroyed. Do you have any suggestions on balancing this risk?
It's a really great question. And unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know, because the violence that has been occurring in response to mutual aid has been so pervasive and sometimes very direct and sometimes very abstract through different forms of violence. How to deter the risk or balance that is something that Julie or Emily, do you have any direct suggestions? Because it's a great question.
Yeah, I guess something that I would want to say first is that we really we're a consent driven and consent first collective. So we don't add sites to the map unless they would like to be added, and we don't publicize their address unless they have given explicit permission for that to happen. And it is absolutely okay if they withdraw that permission at any time. So that is kind of our relationship to publicizing those locations or those addresses. In terms of advice for the problem of visibilizing sites and also visibilizing their vulnerabilities, I think something that in my experience is true of mutual aid is that, our hope with the map is that people are creating their own networks, that they use the map to create their own mutual aid networks, and that when you are in community with somebody, it matters less whether you're, Googling their location or trying to find their needs on a website. We're hoping that people are building real relationships such that some of this information doesn't need to be out there or to be searchable or to be, state visible. Our hope is that this is just the first step for a lot of people in creating mutual aid networks, and that those networks get to a point where they are living and breathing. And those things can't be destroyed because they are, human connection. They're a text that you send somebody when they need something. They're a call for resources when you need them, or a call about abundance when you have it, which I know is not really explicit advice about the problem of a site that is vulnerable to being destroyed. But I think that as we think about mutual aid as central to our mission, mutual aid is not about any one location or any one place where all people receive resources. To us, or to me, that feels like a charity framework. I think mutual aid is about moving towards a world in which we have relationships, and from those relationships, we are resourced and provide resources.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, can you expand more on the intersectionalities of those who were able to receive aid or access aid more efficiently, such as what were the the inequities that disadvantaged groups from accessing these resources?
Yeah, there are many barriers when a resource such as this is only online. And one thing that we hope, or at least that I've even witnessed, is that because this map is literally open to everyone, it can be not only for people who directly search for resources, but also the people who support other people in searching for resources, such as social workers and people working directly with our community members. I know of some people who are social workers who directly look at the map and use the map to help their community members access things. And so it is a barrier, and it is something that I think it is something that we recognize, and something that I think we tried to solve with the flyers, and it is challenging. And so Julie, Emily, I apologize. It's hard to answer because there's so many, it's so hard to try to create access in all of the ways when there is limited capacity, which is what we are finding so often, is that we have very little capacity when we're in a system that is very suppressive of this work.
Thank you. So we have one more question and a comment. So as you all said, so much of this work was taken up by people who suffer under overlapping systems of inequality. Do you have any suggestions or insights on how to challenge and involve more people?
Oh man, this is a big question. That is, I guess my first thought is that I think I can only speak to personal practice here over the practice of our collective, which I think in my experience of the collective, people who come to it are kind of ready to learn how to be in community with other people working towards mutual aid networks or working towards a more equitable Twin Cities. But I think, yeah, so I think within the TC Map collective, there is a kind of shared willingness, even if there's not a shared set of knowledge or vocabularies. I think, like for me personally, challenging and involving other people really just has involved like not compromising on the things that I believe, or not compromising on the things that I believe that this collective represents. And, you know, people who are not open to thinking about mutual aid, people who are not open to thinking about their neighbors as their neighbors, it's hard to move them. And in my experience, without that initial willingness to just engage with the idea of being a neighbor and with the idea of being in community with somebody, like I find it really, really hard to challenge in a way that moves them forward. So I don't really have a good answer there. That's just my personal experience.
Okay. On the subject of maps making visible, although publicizing sites makes them vulnerable, one thing I learned very quickly from TC Map was just how much more vast the mutual aid networks were in the Twin Cities than I even could have imagined, which made it possible to build those networks outside and beyond the map. In a sense, it made the map an intermediary in my life. I made connections with sites and then didn't need to rely on the map as much as I did initially, which was a truly powerful aspect of the map I'm only just realizing. So thank you all for that comment. Okay, another quick question. I really appreciated your discussion of why you chose not to pursue funding. Given that, I wonder how you ensure that your labor is valued and you maintain capacity.
Yeah, so I was actually just in a debate about this with my siblings, so perfect. The thing about this work is you really have to want to do it. You really have to have it as a value within yourself to be able to be engaging in community very intentionally. If we did this out of a sort of desire for funding or for income, I'm not sure that or at least I'm not sure that I would invest as much of myself into the work. And so it's extremely challenging. It's extremely exhausting. Takes a lot. And that's one thing about how it can be unsustainable when it's in this framework. But it ensuring that our labor is valued and we're maintaining capacity has also a lot to do how we engage together as collective members. There have been times where I have been sick and community members organize, one person doesn't have capacity, so then they pick up soup from another member and then they bring soup to me. And we're not only just working like within on this map, but you care for each other as well. And that's what's really crucial in any type of mutual aid network, is you're not only but you're not only like supporting neighbors or working together with your neighbors, but you're working together with each other as well. And it's all a holistic circle. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. We have 2 more questions, and I encourage you to reiterate them in the Q&A at the end. And thank you, Amalia, Julie, and Emily. And we now have a 7-minute break. So, and let me just double check that I'm not trying to cut the break time short too. No, we'll see you all again at 10:20 back in this Zoom space. And thanks again to Tim and to Amalia, Julie, and Emily for your presentations. See you in 6 minutes. Welcome back. It's been a great morning and discussion so far. And the next person to join us is Rebecca Walker, who is speaking on green space, white space, race, real estate, and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Rebecca Walker is a PhD student studying urban environmental planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Her research looks at the racial politics of green spaces historically and today. She uses a critical GIS perspective to interrogate landscapes of environmental injustice, the historic policies that produce them, and how sustainability interventions today might challenge or deepen spatial inequalities. She frequently collaborates with environmental justice movements in her research. So welcome, Rebecca.
Hello, thanks. Let me get sharing going. Okay. All right, participants, y'all should be able to see this. Great. Okay, so thank you for that introduction. As Jennifer said, my name is Rebecca Walker. I'm a PhD student at the Humphrey School. And today I'll be presenting on some research that I've done looking at the history of real estate, racial segregation in the Minneapolis Park Board. So in 1911, Minneapolis held a citywide celebration that they hoped to really use to sort of tell the entire nation that Minneapolis was a leader and that they were sort of this bastion of progress and industrial growth and civic mindedness. And you can see in the background here, I have a postcard that they used to advertise for that celebration. So they sent these postcards out all over the nation announcing a civic celebration and inviting people to come and see what Minneapolis had to offer. And this celebration included historic pageants that were really celebrating the history of settler colonialism, which at that point in 1911 was a very recent history. They had parades celebrating the industrial growth, particularly the milling and the timber industries. And you can see in this image that was from the Minneapolis Tribune at the time, where they had sketches of some of the floats in the parades. You can see that this settler colonial imagery is really on display. But the highlight of the week was a celebration called Linking of the Lakes Day. And the Linking of the Lakes celebration was a day of water parades that was intended to celebrate the opening of a new canal linking Lake Calhoun, which today we call Bde-Makaska, with the Lake of the Isles. And here's a photo of the event from the Park Board archives, and you can see the crowds that are lining the bridges, filling the boats, coming to see the first wave of boats traverse this new canal. And so, yeah, as I just mentioned, it drew huge crowds. Here's another photo of the crowds from the event along the lakeshore, and you can see it's pretty densely packed. And the canal we're talking about is this canal here that connects Lake of the Isles over here with Bde-Makaska. And I'll zoom out just a bit to get a little spatial context of where we're talking about in Minneapolis. And so, The planners of this civic celebration were the city leaders at the time. We're talking city politicians, city council leaders, park board officials, leading businessmen, including real estate developers. And among these was Edmund Walton. And I've highlighted, this is another newspaper clipping, and I've highlighted in red sort of folks to note. So here's George Brackett, and he was a park board commissioner. Charles Loring, the first president of the Minneapolis Park Board. Theodore Wirth, the first superintendent of the Minneapolis Park Board. Some of those names might be familiar to you from Parks Today. And then the list continues. Here's George Falwell. So he was the first president of the University of Minnesota, as well as being a park board member. And then here next to Falwell is Edmund Walton. Now, Edmund Walton was a real estate developer in Minneapolis. And he is perhaps most notorious today for being the first to introduce racial covenants to the Minneapolis real estate market. Here's Walton photographed outside of his real estate office in downtown Minneapolis. So racial covenants, which are shown on this map in red, prevented the sale or occupancy of any property by a person of color. And these covenants were mapped by the Mapping Prejudice Project. And here's some of the language from these racial covenants, and I'll read a few just to give you a sense of the language that was used. No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or lot. This one says, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or lot. And here we have the said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any persons who are not full blood of the so-called Caucasian or white race. So this is, you can really see the racist ideology of white supremacy embedded in the language of these covenants. And it's also important to note the clause right below this that says, and this condition and covenant shall run with the land and bind the heirs, executors, and administrators and signs to the party of the second part. And what this is really saying in complicated legalese is that this covenant sticks with the property. It doesn't matter if the person who initially enacted the covenant then sells it, that land will remain racially restricted, making covenants a really powerful legal tool to enforce racial segregation. And racial covenants became one of the most pervasive tools through which segregation was enforced in the US. And of course, there were extra legal mechanisms through which segregation and these color line boundaries were policed through white violence and intimidation. But in terms of the legal mechanisms, covenants were really one of the most important ones. And so, as I mentioned before, Edmund Walton was, he was one of the planners of the Civic Celebration, and his job in planning the Civic Celebration was the planning of the Linking of the Lakes Parade. And here's a goofy photo from the Linking of the Lakes Parade where they had a wedding ceremony between the two lakes, and this was the first meeting of the lake's waters. And so Edmund Walton was really invested in making sure this celebration was a success. And he hoped it would drum up interest in lakefront real estate because he saw the canals as a business opportunity. So this is a newspaper clipping from the time, and it says, canal zone lots much in demand. And then beneath it, it says, Lake of the Isles district is not checked by May winter weather. And I think anybody who's spent a year in Minneapolis can really relate to the phenomenon of May winter weather. But it doesn't matter, even if it's freezing and snowing in the middle of May, people could not be deterred from coming to come check out the new real estate options that were available in the Lake of the Isles district. And that's what this article is really talking about. And it goes on to include this quote from Theodore Wirth, where Mr. Wirth is really talking about how all of the improvements that the park board is doing to the area around Lake of the Isles, building new boulevards, building the new canal, we're really enhancing the natural beauty of the area, and we're key to drumming up this interest in the real estate development there. And Walton was hoping to capitalize on this interest in real estate. So that in 1909, the same year that that article in the Minneapolis Tribune was published, Walton had purchased 126 lots along the southwestern corner of Lake of the Isles. So he purchased this land, divided it into 126 lots, and then was planning to resell it. Oh God, I'm sorry. Okay, let's get back to, oh geez. Hold on, technical difficulties.
It would not be Zoom without technical difficulty.
Brief interlude. Nice work. Okay, where were we? We were here. Okay, so the area highlighted in red here shows the Walton Hills first edition, and that's right along Lake of the Isles. And then immediately after that, he also purchased land for Walton Hills second edition, so just to the west of that. And included in the land for this Walton Hills second edition was a patch of swampy land along that ran from the second edition to the western shore of Lake of the Isles. And where other people saw a swamp, Walton saw the opportunity to profit. And so Walton purchased this land and then sold the swampy acreage to the park board so that they could begin constructing a new canal that would connect Lake of the Isles to Cedar Lake. And Walton didn't sell this land to the park board out of this altruistic sense and civic pride and the Minneapolis park system. Walton was trying to create waterfront real estate for his new development. And so he sold the land to the park board and they began construction on what we now know is the very popular canal that connects Cedar Lake to Lake of the Isles. And immediately this was seen as a boon to the real estate market in this area. You can see this is another clipping from the newspaper where they're discussing that these improvements from the park board, including the new canal, would make this neighborhood more acceptable and more desirable to property owners there. And then, in addition to making this investment in green space along his new development, Walton made another innovation in the real estate market by adding racially restrictive covenants to the deeds of the Walton Hills second edition. So now I've overlaid the map of where he was donating land with the racially restrictive covenants map, and you can see the language of the racial restriction here. And it says, perhaps some of the most it's like these archaic racial categories where they're saying no persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent shall ever occupy this property. And so in doing so, Walton was aiming to capitalize on both the investment in greenness through these investments by the park board, and also in the whiteness of the space. And this emerged as really a dual strategy for creating value. So you can see here, this is an advertisement that Walton published in the newspaper for this new development. And you can see he's included a map of the site, and he's really highlighting the parkland that this site is adjacent to. He's highlighting the water features. He has the trees from the boulevards drawn in. And so nature and the attractive greenness of this space was really central to his advertising strategy. And then just underneath of that, he includes that language of the racial covenant right in this ad. And so really selling this space as a space that was exclusive for white people only was key to his marketing strategy. And this strategy became central to the real estate market over the subsequent 40 years or so, the next 4 decades. And so zooming out just a bit, Minneapolis is renowned for its award-winning park system. 182 properties, 6,400 acres, 16% of all of the land in Minneapolis, making it the largest landowner in the city. Minneapolis is also known for its wide disparities between its Black and white residents. And I think that one thing that mapping these phenomena together helps us understand is that these are really linked phenomena. So Minneapolis is one of the largest income gaps between Black and white residents, one of the largest gaps in homeownership between Black and white residents. And these gaps, they're spatialized. They have spatial patterns today as well. And so this map shows by neighborhood, the percentage of residents who own their own home. And you can see some of the areas where homeownership is the highest were those areas where racial covenants were in use. And today also continue to have a very high percentage of white residents contributing to those racial disparities. And so the history of both racial covenants and how these developers of these covenanted neighborhoods interacted with the park board helps us understand some of how we got here and how green spaces and whiteness were really used to accrue wealth for the white residents of the city while not providing the same environmental amenities to neighborhoods where marginalized communities, where people of color, where low-income people lived in the city, and that contributes to some of the disparities we see today. And so my research was asking, how did the development of racially restricted neighborhoods shape the Minneapolis park system? And we identified, so we looked at the 47 parks that opened between 1910 and 1953, the period in which racially restrictive covenants were considered legal in Minnesota. And by tracing this history, we can see that there are sort of three pathways through which developers, through which this pattern emerged. One pathway is that there was opportunist development after a new park opened, and developers would swoop in and put in a new development and then add racial restrictions once a new park was announced. Other times developers would write to the park board and say, I'll pay for it if you build a new park in my neighborhood. And that was another mechanism that led to this concentration of parks in these white neighborhoods. And then finally, as we saw in the example with Walton, developers would either sell at a reduced rate or donate land directly to the park board for a new park in their neighborhood. And so you can see this strategy here with the example of Todd Park. So this is 30 years after Walden was developing his addition, and this strategy had become so commonplace of adding both racial restrictions and a park to your development that the developers of the Diamond Lake Terrace addition, located on the eastern shore of Diamond Lake, they didn't even consult with the park board. They just wrote a new park directly into the initial design of the new development and just said, we hereby donate this land to the park board, created a park themselves, and then added blanket racial restrictions to every property in the development. And so this strategy had really become baked into the Minneapolis real estate market. And so I guess zooming out, or maybe trying to take some takeaways from this, what do we learn when we think about our history from a spatial perspective? And particularly, what does it mean for thinking about our community today and sort of the politics of green space today? First, I think one thing that's apparent is that this history helps us understand where some of the environmental injustices in Minneapolis today, how they originated, and sort of the politics of planning and real estate that created some of those disparities. And so in these maps, we have, on the left one, we have where the percentage, neighborhoods mapped by the percentage of non-white population, with darker colors representing more non-white residents and lighter colors representing more white people. And then we have, moving from left to right, tree canopy cover, air quality, emissions, park acreage, and temperature. And you can see that these environmental amenities really map onto those neighborhoods where covenants were in use, and that today continue to be much whiter than other neighborhoods in the city, while exposure to harmful environmental pollution or extreme temperatures is disproportionately concentrated in communities of color. And so looking spatially at this history, we can understand how some of these patterns emerged. It also provides insights into how green amenities and sort of these public investments in green spaces contributed to the racial wealth gap we see in our city. And also understanding this relationship provides a window into understanding the politics of green spaces today. So historically, if we look at our map, we can see that green amenities were really used to, along with these racial categories, were really used to create value in the real estate market. And I think that that's important context for thinking about the politics of green space development today. So this phenomenon is referred to as green gentrification, where greening and park development and new sustainability amenities are used in the process of gentrifying and displacement. So gentrifying a neighborhood and displacing the previous residents. And that displacement is often racialized. And so it's important to think about who are developers catering to with their investments in sustainability amenities, and how can we develop green spaces in a way that doesn't create displacement, but really centers the needs of communities that have been living in neighborhoods that have experienced historically environmental racism and marginalization, and challenge this link between and challenge green gentrification and displacement. And so that's what I'm going to leave us with. This is an artist rendering from the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment in North Minneapolis, which is a development publicly owned land that's planned for upcoming years, and residents of North Minneapolis are quite concerned about the potential for gentrification from this site. And I think thinking about our history of green space and race in the city really challenges or brings us to think critically about how this development will shape the future of Minneapolis and North Minneapolis, and is something that I'm thinking about a lot in my research. So I'll wrap it up and take questions, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And we already have questions. And the first one is, are there similar maps to the ones that you showed from St. Paul?
That's a great question. And the short answer is not yet, but there will be really soon. So Mapping Prejudice just finished the work of transcribing all of the or identifying all of the racial restrictions and deeds for Ramsey County, and they're in the process of spatializing those, so putting those onto a map. So that map is in progress and will be available soon. And then, so I do my research as part of a research team called the CREATE Initiative. And so researchers in the CREATE Initiative are working on looking at some of these same relationships between the history of green space and racial covenants in St. Paul and in Ramsey County.
Great. And I noticed that Kirsten Delegard from Mapping Prejudice is on this webinar. And so Kirsten, would you enter the Mapping Prejudice URL in the chat for everybody, please? I'm putting you on the spot, I realized. Okay, so another question says, wonderful presentation. What tool did you use to tell this story? The inclusion of the historical documents is such a nice addition.
That's a great question. And I think one of our other presenters is going to talk a lot about the different spatial tools. So I'm presenting using story maps. And I use story maps to actually do a lot of this research because it allows you to pair this quantitative mapping data with qualitative data and sort of look at these stories spatially through time, and think about these different forms of knowing together. I'm going to diverge and not exactly answer the question, but one thing that I didn't include in this map, but that I think that Story Maps has the capacity to do, and that is one of the next directions for my own research, is including more of those participatory elements. The previous speaker spoke a lot about decolonizing our map making and our spatial data. And that's also been central to the ethos of Mapping Prejudice, where they've had community members producing this map. And one thing that I would like to do as the next step of this narrative is really try and spatialize some of those stories of resistance and of placemaking in our green spaces of people in color in Minneapolis. I think that the way that I've told the story now presents somewhat of a flat picture where we're just seeing this history of racial oppression through green spaces. And we're not seeing the way in which people of color have really taken the spaces and made them their own. And I think that story mapping has the potential to do that, where we can include some of those participatory elements and more creative storytelling formats and put that on the map and put that in conversation with other data that we have mapped here.
Thanks so much. And you have a compliment. Wonderful work. Thank you for using this history to frame contemporary policy discussions, which leads into a question I have. So you mentioned that you have a collaborative research team, and I wondered if you could talk about the nature of the collaboration, its engagement with the community, and how you hope your research will be used.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I said I'm part of the CREATE initiative, and the CREATE initiative was started by Kate Derrickson and Bonnie Keeler in the geography department and Humphrey respectively. And one thing that I have really valued is working with the CREATE initiative is that in addition to academic researchers, CREATE is really led by this think tank of community members where we have leaders from the community who are engaged around community development, environmental justice, helping us to identify issues that are central to their communities and think critically about how academic knowledge might serve to advance the work that they're working on. And so my first entryway into research in Minnesota was through the CREATE initiative and looking at the question of green gentrification. And this really emerged from community concerns about how property values and rents were rising around parks in Minneapolis, and with a window towards looking towards the Upper Harbor Terminal. And so I think that having our work be guided by issues that are central to community members, and particularly communities who often don't have the same access to academic knowledge or research that, say, the developers or city government might have, grounds our work in community and has grounded how I'm planning my work. And so in terms of how I hope this is used, when I started this project, I was hoping that knowing this history of the Minneapolis Park Board would change the conversation about sort of the politics of greening. I think it's easy to think that any investment in green space is good for everybody, that greening is good for all, when in fact the history of investments in greening in Minneapolis and all over the nation is a lot messier. And some people have really benefited from it, and some people have been quite marginalized by our investments in greening. And so how can we think more critically about how we're investing in our green spaces today?
Great, thank you. So another person says, great presentation. What can urban planners do with your research to change their practice in contemporary times?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think something that I'm personally thinking a lot about. I would say there are maybe a few elements to think about. One is some of what I've already said is just thinking critically about greening and sustainability initiatives. That I think it's easy to just assume that any environmental initiative is going to be good, when in fact we have to think critically about who's benefiting from these investments. And thinking about who our partners are. One thing that emerges for me in this research is the way in which the Park Board and green space developments have gone hand in hand with real estate development historically. And so how are we thinking about who's partnering with the Park Board? Where is funding for new park developments coming from? Is it coming from real estate developers? Which real estate developers are being prioritized? And can we shift some of that collaboration or prioritization to community members and really center the voices of communities in our planning? Another thing that for me is a central takeaway from this research is that we can't think about these systems separately, that our investments in our green spaces is so tied to housing and to who's living where, who can afford to live where. And so we really have to think about these systems as quite connected. And when we're thinking about new investments in greening, we need to be thinking about investments in public housing and really deeply affordable housing and protection for long-term renters, or prioritizing long-term tenants. So really thinking synthetically across these different areas, I think is going to be key for planners going forward, trying to not repeat the past.
Great, thank you. And there was sort of a question that was sort of a more policy dimension or oriented question, but I think that addressed some of the issues. And so I'm going to group two questions, which is to say, I'm curious about what the racial demographics of the city looked like and how they changed during this period. Were racial covenants a reaction to people of color coming to the city, or were they preemptive? And another question that says, will you be looking at how these histories have impacted the long-term social and health outcomes of Black residents?
Yeah, both really good questions. I think one thing that's interesting in Minneapolis is that throughout the history in which racial covenants were used, the population of people of color was quite low in the city, especially compared to other northern Rust Belt cities at the time, that we're seeing a much larger influx of Black residents and other non-white immigrants. Minneapolis did not quite see the same change in racial demographics, but the population of people of color was growing during this time, and there were race riots in Chicago and then also race wars in Minneapolis, and I think some of this fear and worry among white people that people of color were coming to Minneapolis, and sort of this imagined presence was really key to the initiation of racial covenants in Minneapolis. I see that that Ryan Matkey just dropped some info in the chat, and I click on that and learn more. But Mapping Prejudice has done some really great work to try and understand some of this history of the emergence of racial covenants in Minneapolis. The second question was, are we going to continue this work and connect it to other social and health outcomes in Minneapolis? I would love to do that. I would say that that we're all playing to our strengths on this, and I would love to collaborate with other researchers who maybe have a background in public health and could help do some of that work. I think some of the preliminary mapping that we've done of things like asthma rates really shows that that racial covenants can understand some of the patterns of health outcomes in Minneapolis. And so I think that that's a really important next step for our work, and would love to pursue that.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. If we didn't get to your question, hang on to it for the later Q&A, and Rebecca will also see your question. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Fernando Berga, who will be presenting Minneapolis Panorama, Visualizing a History of the Future of Minneapolis. Dr. Berga is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, with the dual appointment in the University of Minnesota's Extension Division. His research, teaching, and service focus on immigrant incorporation, planning history, and urban food systems. These scopes are informed by three principles. First, a reflexive inquiry about the ethics of expert knowledge and the use of qualitative research. Second, the application of design to build awareness, harness data, and enable urban planning and public policy advocacy. And third, a commitment to engage community actors who are disenfranchised from the planning and public policy fields due to race, class, and citizenship status. So welcome, Fernando Berga.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. It's great to be here and witness all these wonderful presentations. I'm going to start by providing you with the link of the website that is the Minneapolis Panorama project. So you should be able to check out the website. And now, if you just give me a second, I'm going to link to the PowerPoint presentation that I would like to give. Oops. Okay. I think everyone can see this. Okay, I assume that everyone can see this slide. So thank you so much for the invitation and being part of all these wonderful, really deep dives into what space, place, and cities mean in the current moment as we experience not only disruptions, but also a lot of challenges at the personal level. I'm going to be sharing with you a project that is called Minneapolis Panorama. You can see it on the website. The goal of the Minneapolis Panorama project is to really consider a history of the future, in a sense. The events that occurred last year and affected all of us impacted, all of us in particular ways. And one of the things that struck my imagination as soon as we experienced here in Minneapolis what we went through was how the places which would become emblematic would start to change, and how they would change based on power, capital, and how rapidly interests gear themselves around certain locations of the city where there is accumulation, but also dispossession. So the Minneapolis Panorama is an attempt to visualize change forward every year. Essentially, the goal of the website is to develop a sequence of panoramas for Lake Street and West Broadway, in which we could capture that change over time. The pictures are taken every summer, and the goal is to do this as long as I can, to be able to mark that change through a series of panoramic views that not only give us the expanse of the corridors and their transformation, but then allow us also to consider specific transformations that happen in the built environment through a sort of visual coding. There have been other panoramas done in Minneapolis. These are just two examples of two historical digital projects from Historypolis, which I all recommend you check out. It's quite an inspirational website if you're interested in urban planning history and urban history in general. But also to step back a bit, the panorama is a trope that has existed in the understanding of the city for centuries. You can look at panoramas that emerge from medieval times through the 19th century when new technologies started to occur. They went from paintings to photography. And even this century, we can see that panoramas have been used in different ways to capture the landscape. Obviously, all these representations are filled with both positive and negative dimensions, right? Obviously, they have also been informed by certain normative assumptions of what the city should be and should be not. So the notion of the panorama for me is a fascinating trope, and I wanted to engage it with all its complicated features to, in a sense, get dirty with it, to be able then to apply it to our current times and be able to consider what are its possibilities. The panoramas that are shown here are two panoramas from the city of Minneapolis, and there's many other panoramas from the city of Minneapolis, but they certainly are informing and enigmatic and fascinating in the way that they take us back in history, right? With the Minneapolis Panorama project, I recognize immediately the possibility of using a website, which is a very simple platform to let the world know about the panorama and also build forward, not only make a snapshot, but also create a commentary and a discussion about moving forward in the future and what would that mean. In doing the panorama, I went back to some of the authors and the thinking that inspires me in urban planning work. So I wanted to step away from the map. I wanted to step away from the top-down totalization of the urban environment and engage a different, totalization, for lack of a better word, of the expanse of the street. There have been many writers and thinkers that have thought about this, and this is a handful of them. But certainly, we cannot think about the panorama today, especially as a critique and as a tool for urban planning, without thinking about Jane Jacobs and questions that have to do with eyes on the street and mixed use, which every time I reread Jane Jacobs, I recognize how contemporary she is. Certainly the work of Kevin Lynch and navigation through the city. We have other works, John Gell, who considers how users use the city, particularly children and the elderly. And certainly Cullen, who is a British geographer who also considered how we navigate the city through a set of episodes, right? So all of these thinkers that have come before represent sort of like, arguably an unrecognized qualitative tradition in the way we do urban planning. And arguably, they challenge the way we do urban planning in Minneapolis. And they also confront the culture and the tools, the techniques, and the data of how we do urban planning in Minneapolis with qualitative questions which remain to be answered, right? And these range from the identification, the collection of data, its synthesis, but also its sharing and community engagement, right? So I wanted to engage some of these thinkers and others that have come before and think about the panorama as sort of like a retooling of urban planning work through a qualitative lens that involved visualities, but in new ways. Oops. Oh, there we go. Let me start by the method of the panorama. And I hope that some of you maybe have had the opportunity to actually check out the website and look at some of the materials that are there. The panorama is a fairly simple but rigorous and tiring process. It involves walking the city, which is something that we all do. So there's a certain pedestrian-centric methodology embodied an effective way to engage the city. In a sense, the instrument is your body, right? And that is certainly informed by biases and positionality and all aspects of how you do and how you collect qualitative data. But it involves walking the city, usually on a Sunday morning. This is when I do it because there's less people on the street. Taking pictures every 25 paces, more or less, which allows you to give you a frame, which allows you to overlap the next frame. Avoiding taking pictures of people, although that hasn't always been successful because of privacy. Certainly you are on the street, you want to avoid taking pictures from people. And develop sort of like a repetitive frame, a repetitive approach to this. You want to keep on doing the same thing over and over again. So that's sort of like the field work of the panorama. And as you are walking and taking pictures, you are smelling, sensing, hearing, seeing, you're capturing a whole set of other factors which are not in the picture, but they certainly inform your interpretation of the picture later on. Afterwards, the work of the panorama involves the digital work, which essentially is stitching together these photos, identifying the layers of difference through an act of freehand drawing. So looking at the photographs, printing them out, then being able to identify by drawing what are the things that have changed, what are the elements that are new in the panorama, prototyping that visualization, and then publishing on the website. We are on literally the cusp of generating the next panorama. So I just finished developing the field work for this new sets of panoramas last week. It takes a long time. It is rigorous. Lake Street takes about 6 hours to walk on both sides, and West Broadway takes about an hour and a half. And sometimes you have to go back and take pictures again because your picture wasn't the best one. It didn't come out the best possible way. So this is the methodology of the panorama, which I want to note, also calls out a very simple and straightforward way of collecting information and putting together information. Arguably, the digital work requires some technical knowledge, but the act of walking and taking pictures is something that we all do. And that's something that also attracted me immediately to the question of the methodological, interrogation of this project, right? This notion of we can all do a panorama is something that remains with me as I move forward through the development of this project. I'm sorry that it's a little bit slow. Oh, there we go. So what are some of the things that we're seeing differently? And these are things that remain to be coded. These are things that remain to be visualized, but these are things that at least I have noticed as I walk through the street. And this is a small collection of key variables, for lack of a better term. Certainly there's new construction that has started to occur on these corridors. There have been previous construction that now has reemerged or continued after last year. There have been sites that have been rebuilt, sites that have been cleared, a lot of commercial activity that remains open and closed, art and graffiti interventions that have been erased, but others that remain. Interestingly enough, the introduction of surveillance at different locations, also the introduction of new land uses, alternative land uses that have to do with the occupation of space. A notion of more use value, such as urban gardens and those types of uses, rather than exchange value, which is usually what we have in the comprehensive plan. So these are some of the changes that I'm starting to see as I look at the panorama and walk through these places. But certainly there's many others, right? There's many others that remain to be coded and identified. For the purpose of this presentation, I just wanted to bring some that are immediately visible. Moving forward, as I mentioned, we just finished year 2. And I say we because this is a project that involves me and another person. They are a student of urban studies. I don't know if she's in this call, maybe she is. But I have been, through the year, been aided by Dash, which is a wonderful and excellent platform to support professors on all kinds of digital applications. And now I'm being supported through Minnesota Transform, which is a new grant effort that looks at the humanities and all aspects related to urbanism, planning, and history. Really excited to be part of that cohort. So I'm working with a collaborator. Usually this is me and one other person to do this type of work in really close collaboration to be able to move the project forward. We're stitching the new photographs together. We are gonna start to compare and contrast difference, and that's, like I mentioned, is a little drawing exercise. Identify the changes. The prototyping of the panorama visualizations is something that is gonna happen outside of the website before it's published, but it will require thinking about what we show, how do we show it, what kind of coding do we use, what kind of visual coding do we use, and how will we do that? And also thinking about developing a panorama guide, something that would be a pamphlet, in some sort of format, maybe in a comic strip, so that people may be able to think about how do they develop their own panoramas for their neighborhood. I imagine one day perhaps a panoramathon in Minneapolis or St. Paul, in which we all maybe take pictures of our corridors or our streets or whatever we like, and create all kinds of panoramas so that we can all participate in the sort of like the documentation of the city, and with that build different perspective, more qualitative, street grounded perspective on how to do planning. Certainly there have been new sort of like disruptions and unrests, sad episodes that have involved underrepresented residents, activists, and the police in other areas of particular Lake Street. So other ways to think about this is also to extend the panorama beyond. I stopped at a particular point in Lake Street because Lake Street is a fascinating street. It's so long. It is an amazing corridor in terms of the diversity. And now some new events call for the extent of the panorama. So I think that is it. I don't have any more slides. And I will now invite any question that anybody would have. I hope I have not run out of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Fernando. And there's a question in the chat that I think is for you, so I'll read it.
Yes.
Do you include public open spaces and housing when you're doing your panoramic work? Is it literally everything in your view, so to speak?
Yes, I don't disqualify any type of building typology or any sort of space. It looks the way it looks, and I take a picture and I go to the next picture. In that regard, to answer your question more specifically, there is housing in the panoramas. There's also open spaces, there's park space, there's cemetery space, there is abandoned space. You essentially get a view of the street from the pedestrian as literally as you were walking the street. I don't make a difference between this looks good, this looks bad. I get into a zen in which I'm like 25 paces picture, 25 paces picture. And let me tell you, I don't know if you have ever tried that, but it is an amazing experience. I have to do it on a Sunday morning. It's tough. I don't want to wake up, but I do it. And the moment I start, I get into a rhythm, and I want to do this for all of Minneapolis. It's quite an experience, and I get to learn and see Lake Street and West Broadway in a different way, because there's details that escape you when you are biking, when you are driving. Certainly, as a cisgender male, there's privilege in walking the city at these times. Even there's a certain flânerie attached to this, right? And that's part of the contradiction of the Minneapolis panorama. But those are, I think, interesting things to engage and converse about, which also lead to kind of like these questions of methodology, in my opinion.
So here is a sort of methodological and interpretive question. What biases are you concerned about with the panorama method?
Certainly, that's a great question. So, given my responsibilities as an assistant professor, there's only a certain set of things that I can do. The panorama really just gives you a surface level perspective of the street, right? You can see physical changes that happen on frontages that are on the street. What you do not see are other types of dimensions and relationships which are key to neighborhood change, gentrification, urban planning, disaster capitalism. Questions that have to do with ownership, for example, are key. Questions that have to do with renting and renters. These questions that are beyond the frontage, beyond the surface of the frontage, are things that are difficult and arguably beyond the scope of the panorama. Certainly, there's ways to map those, and there's ways to use the panorama almost like as a layer to engage what happens beyond. But the social life, the histories, the complexity of tenure, and how policy affects the everyday life of those people and users of the spaces beyond are something that cannot be captured in the website, and they cannot be captured in the panorama. My hope is that at a particular time, when this project starts to build through the years, the panorama and its uses inside the website and outside the website become a platform, an interstitial sort of like artifact, for lack of a better word, to be able to then engage the more deeper conversation. So rather than starting from the documentation of the map and the GIS project and sort of like the totalization of the city, my approach is to start from the street to start to engage those things. And certainly there's some things that you can imagine by looking at the frontage, its materiality, its changes, signage, color, things like that but you don't get into that detail that is so important.
So you mentioned that you've been doing this project with a graduate student collaborator. Have you used this in your teaching and had your students do their own panoramas? And what kinds of conversations has that generated, if so?
Yes, I have used the Panorama last year in a project that was looking at shared mobility hubs and their design and placement in the Twin Cities. A student, Robbie Seltzer, I don't know if Robbie is here, maybe he's here. He is somebody who I consider a great colleague and collaborator. Actually, we both have an affinity towards the Panorama and towards qualitative research. So Robbie was keen in developing a series of panoramas last year because he worked with the design team in the land use class that I taught, which in a sense provided a contextualization of the shared mobility hubs in the particular sites where they were located. This year also I'm teaching that class, and slowly but surely I'm building sort of like the imagination of how can we use the panorama and what are ways to use the panorama. The challenge is that the panorama can become a very superficial tool, right? You just document, you go and you take pictures and then you just leave and you put these things together. But, it requires, sort of like more reflection, right? And understanding to kind of get deep into what can we do with this? How can we use visualization to adapt it and to codify this in the present as well as the future? So those are things that I'm thinking about in my teaching to introduce as exercises that could be really beneficial for the students.
So you mentioned sort of surprising things that you learned through the panorama, one of which was the rise of surveillance and the presence of surveillance technology. Yes. And I wondered if this is something, again, your colleagues and students are seeing, or when you use this kind of visual technique, what have been the kind of surprises, I guess? I wouldn't notice any other way.
What is surprising to me is that they are there, at least to me. Their presence is not hidden. It is not discrete. It is strategic. It is located in key places, right? And this is really interesting to me because we talk about walking the street and taking pictures, but the experience of walking the street and taking pictures and suddenly know that you are in a picture, right, is sort of like a little bit of a disconcerting experience. But I imagine everyone who walks through those points and how they may feel walking through those points, right? It also makes me think about how these landscapes have layers of planning and control and governance which are not visible and become strategically visible at certain points for reasons, right? Which are beyond what I know and can see. So there's a lot of that going on. And, also, as I mentioned, there is the use value aspect to things, people using spaces in order to have temporary uses for all kinds of activities, from urban gardening to shelter, to being able to just congregate, right, where they can't, right? So there's a certain quality to the right to public space and the right to the city, if you want to get conceptual, which the panorama lends itself to. And I'm excited to think about how to codify that so that we can start to use this as a method to visually represent some of these social theory conversations, right, which have remained outside or on the margins of planning, right? So I'm really excited about that prospect.
Well, that's kind of a nice segue into the next question, which is, can you explain why it is important to take photos without people for these panoramas?
Yes, I mean, I always try to put myself in another person's, shoes, for lack of a better term. I don't know if, if I were walking on the street, if there were some random guy taking pictures of me across the street, if I will feel comfortable with that. So I start from that position of just being empathic. I do not know who's walking on the street. I do not know if they want to be in a website that will be, that will remain. This is something that I learned from the first Panorama. On the first Panorama, we did have some people that were included, and this was an exercise that I did with the students. It was hard to do, and we were learning, but I learned just that it wasn't a good idea to respect people's privacy, and also to, just be able to ensure that their presence doesn't exist forever on the internet. I'm actually in one of the panoramas, so the student took a picture of me, and I'm like, oh great, I'm gonna be here for perpetuity, But so those are some of the privacy issues that I think are really important to respect. It's not always successful, and it takes time, and you need to stay on a particular point and sort of like linger around to sometimes take these pictures. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that, there is a very kind of like, Hopper-like quality to the pictures by just showing them like that, which to me is appealing. Others may disagree, in the sense that they almost start to look overly aesthetic, or almost like, these episodic paintings. And one of the things that I'm also thinking about is sort of like how the Panorama is not just a research project, but a performance in itself, a performance of knowledge production. And what does that mean, right? And how can we think about research also in that way, towards a more humanistic approach, right? So those are two reasons why I do that. There may be others, and I also welcome counter arguments about this. This is why I do this, because I think it's the right thing to do, but I may be wrong about it.
Well, thank you so much, Fernando. And again, we hope to have a few minutes at the end for any more questions. And I am going to introduce now, last but certainly not least, Thinking Spatially's own Stacy Stark to take the Zoom stage and talk with us about the many research initiatives and support services that USpatial has to offer. And Stacy Stark is the Associate Director of USpatial, a center within research computing in the Office of the Vice President for Research. There, Stacy manages an ongoing hazard mitigation planning program for Minnesota counties, as well as contributes spatial thinking and analysis to research projects in many disciplines. Stacy is also co-leading a new UMN GIS in K-12 collaborative that aims to accelerate geospatial literacy and GIS use in K-12 teaching environments. So the floor is yours, Stacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about USpatial now to wrap this up. What great presentations we've seen of how maps can play a role in community engagement and engage people with really meaningful and exciting content. USpatial is at the heart of our university's spatial capabilities. We offer help desk and workshops and services to not only support, but also drive the fast-growing need for GIS and spatial tools expertise across the system, all 5 campuses. We have created new opportunities and synergies around spatial research, teaching, and service. We've actually been recognized nationally in many venues as a leading model for how universities can do this. I'm most proud of our just connections and collaborations across the university in different disciplines, and able to help other people with their networking as well. I think the interests of the audience today span the spectrum from using spatial technology to collect data for community research to using the engagement with the public for with technology as research, and also using spatial technology to conduct the output or the outreach at the end for engagement. I'm going to touch on a few more examples of this just briefly, and then I'm going to provide some information about how USpatial might be able to help you. There are two websites listed here. The first is the website which has information about our technical resources and trainings, uspatial.umn.edu. And then the second one is our Spatial University Hub. And if you haven't seen this, this is something that USpatial manages, but we post projects here of ours that we've collaborated and worked on ourselves, but also anyone across the university is welcome to share their information here. Just let us know if you have something to share. It's a resource that ties all the disciplines of University of Minnesota around geography and spatial thinking and how we do that well. At the bottom of the page, there's a gallery of research from across the university system that demonstrates how our contributions to spatial thinking make an impact across and outside of the university. There are examples here of crowdsourcing data, web applications, dashboards, and story maps that will be inspiring to your work. So again, please let us know if you have something to contribute there. Also, there's a feature on the site now about a project that our director, Len Knie, and a student research assistant put together with the nursing school. And this was a project that was a crowdsourcing application, highlights some of our application development for public engagement. This web application got some press because of its kind of unique but extremely practical duty as mapping where restrooms can be found all across Minnesota on bike routes. So it's called Minnesota Bike and Go, and it can be found here. And the mobile application can be downloaded, and then as you're biking along, you can fill out a survey to submit your information about the restroom and its conditions where you are. The next item is a map of community engagement itself. And this map was developed as part of the university's MPAC 2025 system-wide strategic plan. The public engagement footprint will be used by faculty and staff to locate, identify, and connect with others working in the same geographic area or on similar topics. Stakeholders from outside the university use the map to learn about the University of Minnesota, service, outreach, and community engagement taking place in their neighborhoods, communities, and around the state. The Office of Public Engagement is really hoping that this will expand and that we can get all kinds of research and outreach work on this map. And it seems to me like it's showing only a fraction right now of what could be there. Kate Carlson of USpatial created this map, and the interface allows users at that link there, z.umn.edu, submit footprint, to contribute their own engagement projects to the map. A combination of GIS software tools are used to collect and present these locations, Survey 123 and ArcGIS Online. These are both easy tools to learn about. There are things that we have a lot of expertise in, but we'd also have some workshops to show you how to do this. We have a lot of students that are able to stand up these kinds of applications themselves. So take advantage of that. Some of USpatial's skilled cartography has been shown off in this We Are Water exhibit. If you've seen this, it's been shown across the state. It was a project with 6 different state agencies and they connected with the Water Resources Center at the University of Minnesota. This traveling exhibit examines water issues statewide and in local communities through personal stories, histories, and scientific information. It strengthens Minnesotans' relationships with water. It exposes visitors to new perspectives and increases participation in water stewardship activities. I'm showing here the wall size map that was a physical representation of watersheds around the state. So each location had a different wall size exhibit of a map. And you can see here the website where you can go and interact with the online map, which has audio stories from submissions all across the state about their water connections to their water resources. This next example is an example where we contributed a story map and a story map workshop. It's actually somewhat similar to the previous example. Jennifer Moore and John Hatcher, professors in journalism at the University of Minnesota Duluth, worked on this project, sort of similar to the previous one, but I wanted to share this one as well because there was more emphasis on shared history and community around the St. Louis River flowing through and exiting in Duluth, Minnesota. The project was driven by journalists, storytellers, musicians, and playwrights. This is an excellent example of how community engagement, as well as an illustration of how maps and digital space brought together disciplines we don't always think about spatially thinking. Journalism, theater, entertainers, bloggers, artists, in addition to the expected disciplines. I want to say that this project was really exploring community values and the river that holds us together, in contrast to the more scientific and educational outreach component of the previous one. Just as a side note, this project, there was a theater production that was produced from our university as a result of this, and it was just one of the most fantastic things I've seen at UMD in the theater department. So story maps. And then, as Jennifer mentioned, I'm also working today with Shauna Crossan to co-lead a University of Minnesota GIS and K-12 collaborative. This is in partnership with some others outside the University of Minnesota Alliance of Geographic Educators, Esri, K-12 educators, and others to produce classroom activities, webinars, workshops, and mentorship opportunities. The University of Minnesota collaborative is seeking to reach more research partners within the university who either work with a K-12 audience or have content they would like to deliver to a K-12 audience that we could support with skills and outreach. We're developing a relationship now with Mapping Prejudice to extend some of the work they've already done to reach out to K-12 environments to develop possibly a geo-inquiry that could be used for a diverse audience, but is a very simple educational tool. This is a way that we might be able to help you, and I bring this up because it's our own community engagement project, but there might be other opportunities to partner with us. These Minnesota geo-inquiries are modules that help students build spatial schools as part of their normal middle school and high school classwork. They don't require a login to any GIS software. They're just like a one session lesson in which students use spatial thinking to engage with content. And we have a whole Minnesota-based series of these around what kinds of food, what kinds of crops are grown in Minnesota, food that you could use in Minnesota. We have one on immigration. We have one on shipwrecks in Lake Superior. We have one on early transportation. We have one on tornadoes. So a wide variety of social studies and natural sciences types of subjects. So we've heard today about some very meaningful projects in mapping civic and community engagement. Geography, as you know, is often the foundation from which people bond together on themes and topics and which issues can be connected around. So you can see how spatial technology can play a role in this community engagement. I want to talk to you for a minute now about how USpatial can support you directly with your goals in your research and your engagement activities. So we do provide services of consultation to faculty, students, and staff. We have a place to start with this is our help desk. So that's just uspatial@umn.edu. And these consultation services range from just helping to access software tools or learning which tool is going to be the best for a particular project, but they can also lead to services such as cartography, visualization, simple app building, and GIS processing, such as geocoding data, things like that. And to extend that consultation, we also have a whole suite of things that we can do in terms of research support. So we will often work with faculty to develop some kind of pre-proposal spatial analysis in order to look at a proof of concept kind of thing. This is all done free of charge. We just want to help you get your project funded, and then we do sometimes engage in projects later, but we have quite a bit of flexibility to help you in the pre-proposal phase. That includes also budget estimates for a geospatial component. It includes workshops for cross-disciplinary and system-wide partnerships that might be part of your research project. We have worked with graduate students where a PI is not intimately familiar with spatial tools, and so we might work with a graduate student to develop the methodology and sort of train them along to conduct that research. And we're also happy to partner on larger projects. We have about 45% of our funding through our USpatial group is external or internally funded through work that we do on projects, both externally and internally. We also have a suite of training. So the list here are trainings that we have scheduled now. Story maps and web GIS are the most popular ones to see. I talked a little bit about spatial data collection with Survey 123, which is that survey that allows a public person or a community partner to submit data through a mobile application and have it submitted to a map. We have others, and if you don't see what you need here, again, we're available with consultation to help you find what you do need. So that's all I had today, and I just wanted to please urge you to reach out to us. This is our website here, and then the help desk, or you can reach out to me directly to ask questions. And I can also take questions. I think we have a few minutes here, Jennifer, for questions as well.
Yes, we do. And the floor is essentially open now to questions for Stacy or questions that we didn't get around to previously. And I will just go ahead and start one of the ones that is still remaining, which was for Fernando Berga. Can you talk more about the importance of shifting our understanding of a space from a top-down map to the street level view of the panorama? Does it matter who is taking the panoramas, and would the project look different if it was crowdsourced, for example? And for all of the presenters, since you will probably all may be getting questions, if you want to just unmute your video and you can deliver the answers, and Emily as well, and you can deliver the answers verbally.
Okay, I think there's two questions there. Can you talk more about the importance of to understand top-down to street-level view? Yes. So, I think that there is a vast tradition in urban planning work to achieve an all-comprehensive, embracive view of the city. And there's a great book by a sociologist, last name Scott. It's called Seeing Like the State, in which she specifically captures what this does, right? So there is and I want to know, because I am among mappers here, so I don't want to diminish their work. In fact, I think what I see from the other mappers here is that they're dealing with this tension in productive ways, right? They're trying to capture the utility of the top-down view with the reality on the ground. But essentially, it is a hard and difficult and challenging task. And what Scott really captures is this notion of how policy systems in general, i.e. the state, tends to reduce the complexity, diversity, and nuance of life, of what is actually happening on the ground, into discrete units of analysis, right? And this is something that we see happening in comprehensive planning today in Minneapolis, right? It is very much about high-level aggregate demographic analysis to identify what are disparities, what are locations that require focus or what not, right? And that's what we see. We see this detachment, for lack of a better term, from what is happening on the ground. And when that action takes place, it's usually through community engagement approaches, which themselves become, they get transformed into numbers and of times of engagement. And that's something that I think requires attention, because there is the richness of social life, which challenges the totality of the view of the map from the top-down perspective. And the street level view allows us to then reconsider that from the perspective of the lived experience of the individual or groups that occupy a particular space. Once again, leading to a qualitative imagination of planning, which also requires attention, right? Because that is not, it has its own biases and its own challenges and issues, right? The challenge is that we rely on quantitative analysis and aggregate demographic analysis, and we tend to shy away as planners. And I mean, other people may want to debate me on this, and that's fine. We tend to shy away to these questions that have to do with the qualitative experience, right? And we call them public-private partnerships, or we turn them into numeric data based on number of engagement processes. So that's the first question. Does it matter who's taking the panoramas? No, I think anybody should be taking panoramas. I think anybody can and should. And the idea of the panorama is to not just create harmony, but also perhaps conflict and disagreement. I would love to have counter panoramas, or missing panoramas, or a youth panorama, or a this panorama. I don't know. I'm just trying to do my thing here, and then maybe others will come and kind of come up with their own versions. It'll be great to have a discussion between panoramas and what do they mean, and what doesn't anybody care, and is it useful? I think that's part of the goal. All I can do is provide my version and spell out my reasons, and also make clear my methodology, right? So that perhaps other people can inform and reform that in a way that they seem is applicable. And maybe we can all have a family community of panoramas. Who knows?
Thank you so much, Fernando. Okay. I have two questions that we didn't get around to before. And one is for, okay, I think it's for Rebecca, and apologies if I've directed it to the wrong person, in which case, yeah, it is for Rebecca, I think. Okay, how do you envision this research shaping the future of policymaking? Often research informs policymaking decisions, but where it falls short is in the implementation stage. As researchers, we create great wealths of knowledge for policymakers and stakeholders to use, but getting them to use it is a challenge. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I really liked this question. I think that it's so important to reflect on, and I would love to hear some of the other panelists' thoughts on this question. But I wrote a little bit of a response to this person's question. They had a follow-up, but I'll try and elaborate on some of that. I think that what this question gets at is the relationship between knowledge and power, and where does power come from in our politics, and sort of like what is the role of knowledge or academic research in our political conversations. And as I see it, I don't think knowledge alone is going to change policy. Like, that has to be attached to a political will to make those changes. And to me, like, political power comes from the people. It's in the streets. It's not in like our office buildings or our government offices. And so when I'm thinking about how do I use this or mobilize this research to try and change policy, or how do I see it changing policy, I'm really thinking about how do I communicate it? How do I share it with the public and to publics who could maybe like best mobilize on this research to advance their mission or their goals. And so, I'm still in the process of doing this, but trying to think about how, and what mediums can I share it with people? Can this spark a public conversation about green gentrification or about racial equity in our parks? Because I think that that's where the policy change comes from, is if there is a public discourse on trying to maybe hold the park board accountable for its history of collaborating with segregationist real estate developers, or hold the city accountable for how it enabled segregation and racial disparities in our city to be produced. And so that's really where I see this kind of research changing policy. And I would love to hear maybe other panelists' thoughts on, how do we shape public conversations? How do we shape policy with our work?
Great, thank you. There's another question for you, Rebecca, and I know you typed answers to this, but so everybody can benefit. It says, great work in relaying your information to the audience. I lived in Edina for almost 17 years. I watched 2 Black families come and go within less than 2 years. While I knew nothing of the history of racial covenants until 6 years ago, when I moved back to Minneapolis and learned about mapping prejudice, I can't stop wondering how much this deeper belief system of keeping others out has shaped many policies that created many micro and macro separations and shutting down of people of color in the suburb I lived in. While there are token others in many communities around the Twin Cities, most Caucasians and all immigrants are unaware of the centuries-long belief system of separation. How do you plan, or have you thought how you'll be taking this project into all communities to educate all?
I think that there are, that's a great question, and also some like very important points raised there. And so thank you for submitting that question. I think one point that you pointed out in that question is about, it's not just racial covenants. There are like lots of ways in which this belief in segregation and in white supremacy shaped urban planning and has been woven into the fabric of our cities. There was a big discussion in Minneapolis about the elimination of single family zoning over the last couple of years. And that was really connected to this reality that single family zoning was this other mechanism that, even though it wasn't explicitly racial zoning, was used to create these racially homogeneous neighborhoods. And so I do think it's really important for planners and policymakers to reflect on how our historic policies have been embedded in these belief systems. In terms of how do we share this information with communities? Again, I'll start by highlighting all of the really great work of public communication that Mapping Prejudice does. They've given hundreds, probably maybe thousands is an exaggeration, but it feels like it must be approaching thousands of presentations on their work and different community groups to try and really talk to people, and especially to white people, about the history of covenants. I think when I present my research to people of color, especially Black people from Minneapolis, they're like, yeah, we know, like, these covenants weren't a secret to us. This isn't a hidden history for us. This is something that like really shaped our lived experience of where we felt safe and where we didn't. And the reaction is really different when this research is presented to white people in Minneapolis. And so, yeah, I definitely think that this communication is really important. And I'm grateful for the Mapping Prejudice creates avenues to present this work to community groups. And I think that I've been trying to do that as well, and also through social media and other media sources, trying to get it out there. And I'm open to other like thoughts and suggestions, because I think that work is some of the most important work that I can do as a researcher.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm actually going to pose a question for Mapping Prejudice. And so Ryan, if you want to type an answer in the chat, I'd appreciate it. The question is, has Mapping Prejudice or any of the researchers that you know of who have used their database paid attention to the locations of schools? And also in the chat, Mercy Das reminded people that Hennepin County, and actually, Ryan, I think you could also update this information too, allows people to remove racial covenants easily, and you can reach out to the county to do that. Okay, and Ryan says, not that he knows of in terms of looking at locations of schools, but we're always looking for people to do new things with our data. So if you want to walk away with a research project from this meeting today, we're ready for you. And Ryan also says assistance with covenant removal for broader than just Hennepin County can be found at the URL that he listed in the chat. So thank you, Ryan. And I just want to, let me just double check. I think we have sort of reached the end of our questions. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our panelists for such amazing work and committed work that is making our communities better places to be now and in the future. And I want to encourage all of you all that there are two things to think about. First, as you exit today's webinar, you will be prompted to take a very short 3-question survey. And please do take the time. It really helps us to develop and shape future Thinking Spatially symposia. And we appreciate your feedback. And finally, we did record today's presentation, and the video will be posted to the symposium website and the IAS YouTube channel in about a week. And check back there soon. And there's a question about contact information for the panelists with the titles, and that'll be linked to that should be available on the symposium website, at least the titles and the names, and we'll see about updating that along with when the video is posted. So thank you all again so much, and have a wonderful weekend and enjoy the fall weather, which just started raining.
Thank you all
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.